Sarah Winters grips the wheel, sweat dripping beneath her Stetson, her eyes shadowed by a past she can't escape. Fire, smoke, her brother screams. But today, Highway 83 isn't just a road. A strange cry pierces the air, yanking her from the nightmare. Before her, a small figure darts through traffic, defying death itself. It looks at her, truly looks, and in those golden eyes she sees something. A plea or a gateway to a darkness she can't yet fathom. Will she dare to cross that line? Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. Under the scorching Texas sun, Highway 83 wasn't just hot. It burned like a giant furnace, shimmering waves of heat rising from the asphalt, twisting the air into a trembling nightmare. The roar of engines, the shrill blast of horns, and then, cutting through the chaos, a different sound tore through the atmosphere. A cry, small, wild, but sharp as a blade slicing into the heart. A tiny figure darted out into the stream of traffic, staggering, falling, then rising again, undeterred by the monstrous machines roaring toward it. Luna, the little wildcat, knew no fear. Only desperation blazed in its golden eyes, twin flames flickering in the desert wasteland. Lydia Harper slammed on the brakes, her patrol car skidding with a screech of tires against the pavement. Sweat trickled beneath the brim of her Stetson, soaking the collar of her faded uniform, worn thin after 11 years on the job. At 34, her eyes carried a weight far older, shadowed by a memory she never spoke of. The day, 15 years ago, when she stood helpless as her younger brother burned alive in a wrecked car. Now before her was a scene no one could have predicted. Traffic snarled to a halt, not from an accident, not from human error, but from a tiny creature fighting to survive. Cars lined up in a long, impatient chain. Some drivers leaned out to curse. Others raised their phones to snap photos as if watching a bizarre circus act. But Lydia didn't see entertainment. She saw a plea. She stepped out of the car, her leather boots striking the searing pavement, heat rising to coil around her legs like invisible tendrils. Luna's cry rang out again, closer now, more desperate. Lydia squinted against the blinding sunlight, straining to see. It was a wildcat, a bobcat kitten, its spotted fur matted with dust, its body trembling but unyielding. It darted into the road, then retreated to the shoulder, torn between fear and some purpose no one could fathom. "It's gone crazy!" a man nearby shouted, sweat dripping down his weathered cowboy's t-shirt. "Nearly caused a damn wreck, officer. Do something." Lydia shot him a glance, her eyes cold as steel. "Stay put," she ordered, her voice low but razor sharp. She had no time for complaints. Moving slowly, her hand resting lightly on her holster, a habit born from years of facing the unexpected, Lydia edged closer to Luna. The hot wind whipped past, carrying the scent of burning asphalt and the distant rumble of engines. She knelt about 10 paces away, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid spooking it. Luna froze, its small ears pricking up, its gaze locking onto her. This wasn't the look of a panicked wild animal fleeing in terror. It was watching her, truly watching her, as if it had something to say. Lydia's heart pounded, not from fear but from a strange sensation rising in her chest. A feeling she'd buried since the day she couldn't save her brother. The feeling that she could do something, change something. Then she saw it. A glint flashed under the sunlight, reflecting off Luna's hind leg. Not a wound, not blood, but metal, small and snug against its spotted fur. A device. Lydia frowned, pulling her binoculars from her belt and adjusting the focus. Her heart skipped a beat as the image sharpened. An odd object, unlike any wildlife tracking collar she'd seen in her training. A faint blue light blinked weakly, and numbers were etched into its surface. RW7734. This wasn't an ordinary wildcat. This was a living mystery standing before her, trembling but refusing to flee. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247, Lydia said into her radio, her voice rough from the heat and tension. "I'm at mile marker 143, Highway 83. Got a Bobcat kitten disrupting traffic. But something's off. It's wearing a strange device on its leg. Requesting fish and wildlife support ASAP. Static crackled before the reply came. Roger, Officer Harper. Noted. Fish and wildlife en route. Be careful. It could be dangerous. Dangerous. Lydia glanced at Luna, its golden eyes still fixed on her, as if sizing her up, waiting. The danger wasn't from this creature. The danger lay in what it represented. An unanswered question, an unseen threat lurking somewhere out there. The crowd stirred as a white truck rolled up, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department logo bold on its door. Ethan Caldwell stepped out, his lean frame weathered, his sun-scorched skin like dry timber, his sharp eyes hidden behind thick glasses. A veteran biologist, Lydia had heard of him, an eccentric loner who haunted the forests, driven by an obsession with wildlife after losing his daughter in a disastrous research trip years ago. Officer Harper, he nodded, his voice deep as wind through the woods. Heard there's a bobcat with an odd device? Lydia pointed toward Luna, now sitting, its tiny legs quivering, but its gaze steady. Over there, take a look. Ethan raised his binoculars, his breath catching as he spotted the device. Good God, he whispered, his voice trembling, not with fear but with awe. This isn't ours, not a standard tracking collar. There's a serial number, RW-7734. This is... He hesitated, his eyes widening behind his glasses. This is an emergency beacon, the kind hikers use. A chill raced down Lydia's spine, despite the oppressive heat. What do you mean? A bobcat with a human device? Ethan turned to her, his gaze no longer just sharp, but tinged with dread. I mean, someone put it on this animal, and if I'm right, someone out there needs us, right now. Luna suddenly stood, letting out another cry, this time not desperate, but urgent. It turned toward the dense forest across the highway, where thick trees swallowed the sunlight, cloaking everything in a mysterious shadow. Then it moved, slow but deliberate, glancing back at Lydia and Ethan as if commanding, "Follow me." Lydia's throat went dry, not from the heat, but from a rising premonition, that she was about to step into something bigger than her routine patrols, bigger than herself. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low but firm. It wants us to follow. You ready? Lydia took a deep breath, memories of her brother flashing like a ghost, his screams, the flames, her helplessness. Not this time, she told herself. This time she wouldn't just stand by. Let's go, she said, stepping after Luna into the waiting darkness, unaware that ahead lay a race against death, a secret that would change everything, and a tiny wildcat destined to become an unlikely hero. The darkness of the forest swallowed Lydia Harper the moment she crossed the threshold between the harsh sunlight of Highway 83 and the damp, cool shade beneath the canopy. The rumble of engines faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves whispering like ghostly voices and the faint drip of water from thick foliage. Luna led the way, its small form weaving through thorny underbrush with natural grace, ears erect, golden eyes flashing in the gloom like a guiding beacon. Lydia's breaths grew heavy, not from the heat left behind, but from an invisible pressure tightening her chest. A premonition that each step brought her closer to something she couldn't foresee. Ethan Caldwell walked beside her, his breathing steady but his hands gripping his backpack straps as if they were the only thing keeping him grounded. He hadn't spoken since they left the highway, but Lydia could feel the tension radiating from the man, a solitary biologist carrying an unseen wound. She'd heard whispers about him in the town diner. Ethan, the man who lost his daughter one rainy night in the jungle when the 16-year-old slipped off a cliff during a research trip he'd led. Since then, he'd lived like a ghost, seeking answers in the wild creatures he could never fully comprehend. Luna, with its strange device, was a puzzle he couldn't resist. Do you hear that? Ethan's voice broke the silence, rough and sudden, snapping Lydia from her thoughts. She stopped, tilting her head to listen. The leaves still rustled. A lone bird's call echoed briefly before fading. But there was something else, a faint sound, almost buried, like the groan of a creature in pain. Luna paused ahead, turning to look at them, its golden eyes blazing in the dark. It let out a low growl, not a threat, but a nudge. "It knows we're following," Lydia whispered, her pulse quickening. "It wants us to hurry." Ethan nodded, a spark flickering in his eyes. Not fear, but burning curiosity. "I've never seen a bobcat act like this. Not naturally. Something's wrong here." They pressed on, Lydia's boots crunching over dry twigs, the sharp snaps reverberating in the stifling stillness. The deeper forest unfolded before them, not the serene postcard scene, but a living labyrinth of darting shadows and unexplained sounds. Luna guided them down a narrow trail where the ground sank beneath a carpet of rotting leaves, each step leaving a mark in the wet mud. Lydia crouched, her fingers brushing a depression in the earth, a human footprint, large, deep, and fresh. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and unease. Ethan knelt beside her, his fingers tracing the edge of the print. "Male, size 11 or 12, no more than 2 days old. And look," he pointed ahead, where a broken branch dangled, droplets clinging to its leaves like blood in the dim light. Someone was in a hurry, or running. Lydia stood, her gaze locking onto Luna. The wildcat now stood 10 meters ahead, its small frame taut like a drawn bowstring, eyes fixed on them. It let out another cry, this one high and piercing, slicing through the forest's night-like shroud. Then it turned, bolting forward, vanishing behind a thick bush. "Damn it," Lydia muttered, lunging after it before Ethan could react. She didn't think. She acted, her legs propelled by instinct, pushing through thorns that clawed at her pants, her ragged breaths mingling with the thudding of her heart in her ears. Ethan shouted behind her, "Harper, slow down! We don't know!" But his words were drowned out by the crash of leaves as he followed. They burst through the bush and Lydia stopped short, nearly colliding with Ethan as he caught up. Before them, Luna stood in a small clearing amid the forest. Sunlight pierced the dense canopy, falling in golden blades that illuminated the scene. A tattered backpack lay sprawled on the ground, its straps torn, beside a shattered water bottle, its contents seeping into the earth in a small puddle. Then Lydia saw it. Blood dried into dark red patches on nearby leaves, like ghostly handprints from someone who'd been here. "Good Lord," Ethan whispered, his voice faltering. He stepped forward, kneeling by the blood, his trembling hand brushing a leaf. "This isn't animal blood. Too much. Too deliberate." Lydia's stomach twisted, memories of fire and her brother's screams flooding back, sharp and agonizing. She shook her head, trying to banish them, but the blood on the leaves was a reminder she couldn't escape forever. "Someone's hurt," she said, her voice hardening to mask the tremor. "And Luna knows where they are." She turned to the wildcat, now standing near the edge of a small drop-off, its gaze unwavering. It made a new sound, not a cry, but a low, almost pleading whine. Then it stepped to the edge, peered down, and looked back at them, as if saying, "Come here, hurry." Ethan rose, his face pale beneath his sunburned skin. "RW7734, he said, his voice dropping like a curse. "I checked it on the satellite phone on the way here. It's registered to a hiker at Fortress Ridge State Park. Mason Garrett, 42, missing since yesterday, a wildlife rehab specialist." Lydia whipped around, her eyes meeting his. "You mean this cat belongs to him?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Maybe, or it was sent to find us. If he's hurt, if this blood is his..." He didn't finish, but Lydia understood. Time was running out. Luna whined again, louder now, and started down the slope, its tiny body navigating rocks and roots with astonishing precision. Lydia took a deep breath, her hand tightening on her radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247, she said, her voice cutting through the forest stillness. "We're about a mile east of Highway 83. Mile marker 143. Signs of a missing person, possibly badly injured. Requesting emergency rescue team." Static buzz before the reply. "Copy, Harper. Rescue team mobilizing. ETA 45 minutes. Stay safe." Lydia clipped the radio to her belt, her eyes locking onto Luna, now vanishing down the slope, leaving only a faint shadow in the dim light. "You sure?" Ethan asked, his voice low but laced with concern. Lydia looked at him, then down the drop-off, where an even deeper darkness waited. She thought of her brother, the fire she couldn't extinguish, the silent vow that she'd never let someone die in front of her again. "Sure," she said, her voice like steel. "Let's go." They stepped to the edge, unaware that below lay a ravine, a man battling death, and a tiny wildcat becoming the thread between life and the abyss. The slope plunged into the ravine like a gaping black maw, swallowing light and sound, leaving only the whistle of wind through the rock crevices like the breath of a sleeping giant. Lydia Harper stepped onto the slippery edge, her hand gripping an exposed tree root, her palms slick with sweat despite the chill of the deep forest seeping through her uniform. Luna had vanished below, its faint whines echoing up from the darkness, like an invisible thread pulling her forward. Ethan Caldwell followed close behind, his eyes glinting in the dim light, his hands clutching his backpack straps as if they were his last tether to sanity amidst the haunting memory of his daughter's death. They didn't speak. There was no need. Both felt it. Something waited below, alive or dead, and they had to find it. Lydia slid down first, her leather boots scraping against muddy earth, small stones tumbling beneath her like whispered warnings. "Careful," Ethan murmured, his voice faltering as a loose rock nearly sent him sprawling. She nodded without looking back, her eyes fixed on the darkness below. Then she saw it. Luna perched on a jutting ledge, its golden eyes blazing like twin flames against the ravine's night-like shroud. It didn't move, only stared up at her, then turned its head toward a gap between twisted roots and shattered stone. Lydia held her breath, her heart hammering as the beam from her helmet's flashlight swept downward. A pair of boots. A human leg, motionless, protruding from beneath a massive fallen tree, its blackened trunk coated in moss and dried blood. "Mason!" Ethan's shout shattered the confined space, reverberating like a sob. He lunged forward, nearly slipping, but Lydia thrust out an arm to stop him. "Wait," she commanded, her voice steel despite the tremor in her chest. She swept her flashlight around, the beam revealing a scene that chilled her to the bone. The fallen tree didn't just pin the man's leg, it blocked the way up, trapping him in a natural cage within the ravine. Blood pooled from beneath the trunk, dried into dark streaks on the rocks, mingling with the mud. Then she heard it, a faint groan, almost imperceptible, rising from the shadows. Lydia dropped to her knees, crawling through the narrow gap between stone and tree, her flashlight trembling in her grip as it illuminated the man's face. Mason Garrett. She knew it the moment she saw him. His face was waxy pale, eyes shut tight, lips cracked and dry, but his chest rose and fell, weak but enough to prove he still lived. One arm lay limp at his side, fingers clawed into the dirt as if he'd tried to dig his way out in desperation. Beside him, Luna lay curled up, its tiny body pressed against him, golden eyes never leaving his face for a second. As the light hit it, Luna looked up, locking eyes with Lydia, and let out a soft whine. Not fear, but a plea. "He's alive," Lydia whispered, her voice breaking with a mix of relief and horror. Ethan knelt beside her, his hands shaking as he opened his backpack, pulling out a water bottle and a first aid kit. "Mason, can you hear me?" he called, his voice splintering with emotion he couldn't contain. Mason's eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain and exhaustion, but a spark flared when he saw Luna. "Luna!" he rasped, his voice thin as a breeze. "Good girl." He tried to lift a hand, but it fell back, powerless. Lydia's throat tightened. She looked at Mason, at Luna, and memories surged like a flood. The day she'd watched her brother's car burn, his screams ringing in her ears, the flames devouring every shred of hope. She'd been helpless then, her hands coated in ash as she pounded on the glass, unable to save him. Now before her was a man fading away, and a tiny wildcat had done what she couldn't, fought to keep him alive. "We're getting you out," she said, her voice hardening to hold back the tears threatening to spill. "Hang on, Mason." Ethan began assessing him, his hands moving swiftly but precisely, his eyes flashing with old pain as he touched Mason's leg. A compound fracture, white bone jutting through torn skin, The blood long stopped, but the wound still raw. Broken tibia, severe dehydration, possible shock, he said, his voice low but urgent. We need the rescue team now. Lydia nodded, pulling out her radio, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Dispatch, this is Unit 247. We've located Mason Garrett, ravine 1 mile east of Highway 83, mile marker 143. Critical condition, open fracture, blood loss, requesting medevac immediately. Static crackled before the reply. Copy, Harper. Rescue team ETA, 40 minutes. Keep him stable. 40 minutes, Lydia muttered, staring at Mason, his shallow breast flickering like a candle about to gutter out. He doesn't have 40 minutes. She turned to Ethan, her eyes blazing with a determination she hadn't felt since that fateful day. We have to do something. Ethan nodded, pulling a splint from his pack. I'll try to stabilize his leg. You find a way to lift that tree, even just a little. He needs room to breathe. Lydia eyed the fallen trunk, hundreds of pounds of wood pinning Mason's leg like a death sentence. She had no tools, no superhuman strength, but she had Luna, and she had herself. She knelt beside Mason, resting a hand on his shoulder. Mason, tell me about Luna, she said, her voice gentle but firm, trying to keep him conscious. His eyes widened slightly, a faint smile ghosting across his cracked lips. Luna? She's my family, he whispered. Wife left me, 'cause I love these cats more than her. Luna was the last one I saved. He coughed, blood flecking the corner of his mouth, but his eyes lit up as he glanced at the tiny wildcat beside him. I put the device on her when the tree fell, told her to find help. Lydia felt hot tears well up, but she blinked them away. She did it, she said, her voice trembling. She brought us to you. Ethan worked fast, securing the splint around Mason's leg, but each movement drew a pained groan from him. Luna stood, stepping closer, its nose brushing Mason's hand, golden eyes watching him as if it understood everything. Lydia rose, searching for a sturdy branch to use as a lever, her hands clawing through dirt and rock for leverage. Ethan, help me, she shouted, her voice echoing in the ravine. He rushed over, and together they pushed, sweat streaming down their faces, muscles straining to their limits. The tree budged, just a fraction, but enough for Mason to draw a deeper breath. There! Ethan yelled, but his voice faltered as the ground beneath them quaked. A sharp crack split the air, loud as a gunshot. Lydia looked up, her heart stopping as a massive boulder loosened from the ravine wall, tumbling down with terrifying speed. Run! She screamed, yanking Ethan back, but he froze, eyes fixed on Mason. The rock slammed into the ground mere feet from Mason, dust exploding in a blinding cloud. When it cleared, Lydia saw Mason still there, motionless but alive. Luna stood in front of him, fur bristling, a tiny soldier guarding its master. God Almighty, Ethan whispered, his hands trembling. We can't wait any longer. Lydia dropped to Mason's side, grasping his cold, faintly warm hand. Hold on, Mason, she said, her voice breaking. The rescue team's coming. Luna didn't give up on you, and neither will I. He gave a faint nod, his eyes closing, his breath growing fainter. Luna whined, pressing against him, and Lydia felt her heart shatter, not from fear, but from the realization. She was racing death itself, and this time, she couldn't lose. The dust from the shattered rock still hung in the air, thick as a deathly fog, clinging to Lydia Harper's throat and choking her with every ragged cough. The echo of the impact reverberated through the ravine, blending with Mason Garrett's faint moans, now just a fragile thread tying him to life. Luna stood before him, its golden eyes blazing through the darkness, fur bristling like a tiny warrior refusing to yield. Lydia knelt beside Mason, her hand gripping his, icy cold yet faintly warm, a final flicker of hope. Hold on, she whispered, her voice breaking in the cramped space. The rescue team's coming. But in her mind, the radio's words rang like a verdict. 40 minutes. Too long. Too damn long. Ethan Caldwell crouched by Mason's leg, his hands moving swiftly, securing the splint around the open fracture, fresh blood seeping from torn skin with every touch. His pulse is fading, he said, his voice low but urgent, his eyes flashing with fear he tried to conceal. "We need to lift that tree now." Lydia looked up at the massive fallen trunk, pinning Mason's leg, heavy as a curse. She stood, grasping the branch she'd used as a lever, muscles straining, sweat streaming down her forehead. "Help me!" she shouted, her voice slicing through the frigid air. Ethan rushed over, and they pushed together, the wood groaning under the pressure, but it only budged, a little, then stopped. "Not enough!" Ethan growled, his hands slipping in the mud. Then the rain came. No warning, no mercy. Cold, stinging drops pounded the ravine like 1,000 needles, turning the ground beneath them into a slick, muddy quagmire. Lydia stumbled, her knee slamming into a rock, pain shooting through her, but she didn't care. She stood screaming into the wind. "We're not giving up!" The rain intensified, water rushing through the ravine in streams, washing away dust, washing away hope. Mason coughed, blood pooling at the corner of his mouth, his eyes fluttering shut. Luna whined, pressing closer to him, as if trying to lend him its strength. Lydia watched and memories flooded back, the fire consuming her brother's car, his screams echoing in her ears, her hands pounding uselessly against the glass. "Not this time," she roared, her voice overpowering the storm. "Never again." She threw herself at the tree, clawing at its wet bark, searching for leverage. Ethan yelled, "Harper, you're crazy!" But she didn't hear. She pushed, she pulled, she screamed, her body trembling with exhaustion but refusing to stop. The tree shifted, a little, then more. "Ethan, now!" she shouted. He lunged forward and together they heaved, the wood cracking like thunder. The tree lifted just a few inches, but enough for Ethan to drag Mason's leg free. "Done!" he yelled, his voice cracking with adrenaline. Mason groaned, racked with pain, but alive. Then they heard it, the distant rumble of engines, the whir of rotor blades slicing the air. The rescue team. Lydia collapsed into the mud, her breaths heaving, rain mingling with tears on her face. Helicopter floodlights pierced the ravine, turning the darkness into a chaotic stage. The team rappelled down, swift as lightning. "Cut the tree!" one shouted. "Hurry!" Another rushed to Mason, checking his pulse. "Weak pulse, prep the stretcher." The buzz of a chainsaw roared to life, tearing through the trunk, sawdust flying in the rain. Lydia staggered to her feet, eyes locked on Mason. "Will he make it?" she yelled over the noise. The rescuer looked up, giving a curt nod. "If we're fast." Luna suddenly darted forward, leaping onto the stretcher as they secured Mason. "Back off!" a rescuer barked, but the wildcat ignored him. It stood there, golden eyes fixed on Mason, as if saying, "I'm not leaving." Lydia stepped forward, her trembling hand brushing Luna's wet fur. "Let it go," she said, her voice firm. "It saved him." The rescuer hesitated, then nodded. They hoisted the stretcher, rain pounding down, the helicopter's lights sweeping over them like a fragile promise. But the ravine wasn't done with them. Another crack split the air, louder, more ominous. Lydia looked up, her heart stopping as a slab of the ravine wall broke loose, rocks tumbling down like an avalanche. "Run!" she screamed, shoving Ethan out of the way. The rescue team scrambled to the chopper, Mason's stretcher hauled aboard in a split second. Lydia fell, rocks slamming into her legs, but she crawled up, eyes never leaving Luna. The wildcat stood on the stretcher, looking down at her, its golden gaze piercing through the rain and darkness. The helicopter lifted off, its rotor blades drowning out all sound, carrying Mason and Luna into the sky. Lydia stood there amid the shattered ravine, rain drenching her, her hands clutching the mud. Ethan pulled her up, his voice hoarse. "You did it, Harper." She didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the vanishing helicopter, taking Mason, Luna, and a piece of her she hadn't known was missing. They'd survived, but at what cost? She didn't know. Only that her brother's screams had gone silent in her mind for the first time in 15 years, replaced by Luna's cry, echoing forever. They climbed into a second rescue vehicle, rain still streaming down her face. Ethan looked at her, his gaze softening. "It didn't just save him," he said quietly. "It saved you too." Lydia didn't reply, staring into the darkness where the helicopter had disappeared. She wasn't sure if she'd been saved or had just stepped into another story, one where Luna, Mason, and she would be forever bound. The helicopter's rotor blades faded into the rain and darkness, leaving Lydia Harper standing amid the ravaged ravine, water streaming down her face like tears she'd never admit to shedding. Her boots sank deep into the mud, her hands still clutching a fistful of earth. The remnants of the battle just fought. Ethan Caldwell stood beside her, his breath heavy, his eyes tracking the helicopter's blinking red lights until they vanished behind the dense canopy. Mason Garrett and Luna had been saved, but at what cost? Lydia didn't know. All she knew was that a strange void was forming in her chest, not pain, not relief, but something she couldn't yet name. The rescue vehicle carried them out of the forest, its headlights sweeping across wet trees, turning them into ghostly shapes gliding through the night. Lydia sat in silence, her trembling hands resting on her lap, rain dripping from her soaked hair onto the floor. Ethan glanced at her, his gaze softening behind fog glasses. "You did it, Harper," he said again, his voice low like a comfort. She didn't reply, only stared out the window where the forest's darkness gradually gave way to the faint lights of Highway 83. In her mind, Luna's cry echoed, not desperate, not urgent anymore, but a whisper, a thank you, or a goodbye. She wasn't sure. 6 months later, Lydia stood among the crowd at the Texas Wildlife Ambassador Center, her police uniform replaced by a simple shirt, her hair tied back to reveal a face less etched with strain. The center was a marvel, sprawling enclosures mimicking nature, educational plaques telling the stories of animals unable to return to the wild. But all eyes were on Luna, the little wildcat, now larger, its spotted fur gleaming in the sunlight, golden eyes shining like gems in the central enclosure. Mason Garrett stood there, no longer in a wheelchair, leaning on crutches but beaming as he cut the ribbon. "Luna didn't just save me," he told the crowd, his voice warm yet strong. "She saved us all by reminding us there's a bond between humans and animals we must never forget." Lydia lingered in the crowd, but Mason spotted her. He waved, his eyes lighting up as he called her to the podium. "Officer Harper, Lydia, never gave up," he said, his voice carrying over the speakers. "She saw what no one else did. A wildcat isn't just an animal, but a living soul." The crowd applauded, but Lydia ducked her head, a flush creeping up her cheeks. She wasn't good with spotlights, wasn't good with praise. She just wanted to see Luna again. After the ceremony, Mason led her to a special observation area where Luna sprawled on a rocky ledge, the sunset streaming through the glass, gilding its spotted fur. Ethan was there too, now an advisor at the center, holding a notebook tracking Luna's behavior. "She remembers you," Mason said, his eyes bright as Luna lifted its head, staring straight at Lydia. "Does she?" Lydia asked, her voice soft but curious. Mason nodded. "Bobcats don't usually recognize humans, but Luna's different. You're part of her story." Lydia stepped closer to the glass, her hand pressing against its cold surface, her eyes locking with Luna's golden gaze. She remembered that day, the cry on the highway, the darkness in the forest, the blood on the leaves, the moment she thought she'd lose again. But she hadn't. Luna hadn't let her. "How long will she stay here?" Lydia asked, her voice a near whisper. Mason smiled, but a trace of sadness flickered in his eyes. "Luna can't fully return to the wild. She's too tied to humans, to me, to you. We're building a program, the Wildlife Ambassador Initiative, so creatures like her can teach us about their world." Ethan chimed in, his voice low but fervent. "Luna's story has raised thousands for conservation. People come here, they see her, and they change. One wildcat did what decades of campaigning couldn't." Lydia nodded, but her eyes stayed on Luna. She wondered, was Luna truly happy? Or was it trapped between two worlds, wild and human, like she'd once been trapped between past and present? The sunset deepened, red light spilling through the enclosure, turning Luna into a living statue. It rose, padding closer to the glass, its nose touching where Lydia's hand rested. A soft rumble escaped its throat, not a plea, not fear, but but a gentle, almost familiar sound. Lydia's heart tightened, not from sorrow, but from a feeling she'd never known. Peace. "Thank you, Luna," she whispered, her voice catching in the quiet space. Luna gazed at her, its golden eyes blazing, and in that moment, Lydia felt it understood. Not her words, but something deeper, something language could never touch. Mason rested a hand on her shoulder. "She knows more than we think," he said, his voice low like a secret. "I didn't teach her to save me. She chose to." Lydia turned to him, her eyes flashing with a question she didn't dare voice. Did she choose to stay here too? Mason seemed to read her mind. "I'm not sure," he admitted, "but I hope she's found her purpose, like I did when I saved her." The crowd dispersed, the last rays of daylight melting into dusk, leaving the center bathed in soft artificial light. Lydia lingered, watching Luna one last time. The wildcat turned its head, gazing up at the sky through the glass roof, its golden eyes glinting as if searching for a distant forest, a wild call, or just a moment of freedom it could never fully reclaim. Lydia didn't know. She only knew Luna had changed her, had pulled her from the fire of her past, and left her with a wordless question. Who do we save, and who saves us? She stepped out of the center, the night breeze brushing through her hair, carrying the scent of dry grass and memories of that day on Highway 83. Luna's cries still echoed in her mind, not a plea for help anymore, but a song of life, loyalty, and the invisible threads binding all creatures. Lydia looked up at the sky, where stars began to shimmer, and for the first time in 15 years she smiled. A small smile, but enough to chase the darkness from her heart. Luna, Mason, and she, they'd written a story together, but had it truly ended or only just begun? She didn't need an answer. Luna's gaze at sunset was enough, and so the tale of Nova, Sarah, and Robert draws to a close beneath the sunset at the Texas Wildlife Ambassador Center. A journey from a blazing highway to a deadly ravine, culminating in a symbol of loyalty and the extraordinary bond between humans and the wild. Nova didn't just save Robert, she pulled Sarah from the shadows of her past, leaving us with a lingering question. Who's the true hero here? Though the answer may remain a mystery, Nova's blazing golden eyes and Sarah's first smile in 15 years say it all. That within every tiny creature lies a mighty force, and from every wound, hope can bloom. If this story stirred your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel. Every week we bring you gripping tales, unexpected mysteries, and wonders from the natural world and beyond, just waiting for you to uncover. Join us on this adventure. Subscribe today and never miss a moment.